of that industry for neurodivergent people to start talking to each other and to start getting connected and to start saying, actually, we don't have to let this happen to kids like us. We don't have to let this happen to our community, and to actually start fighting back against it. And now we've connected with folks in every province. We've connected with folks all over this colonial wreck of a planet. And, you know, we've also connected with neurodivergent political groups like the Neurodivergent Labour in the UK and Neurodivergent Labour in Australia. Labour in Australia, of course, having just formed government in the recent election. And the Secretary of Labour Australia of the party is ADHD openly and is part of neurodivergent labor. And the fact that there's stuff like that worldwide and that we're, you know, following in the footsteps of these people that are doing such amazing work and that we're going to get that done here in Canada too, it's absolutely wonderful. And it's hard. It's not easy to fight, you know, your own people. It's not easy to have to say, look, you guys, I know you care. I know that you believe the things you do about autism because you care, but those things are wrong and we need to do better. It's not easy work. People don't want to hear that. People don't want to hear they've been wrong about something that has felt so virtuous to them, has felt so good and so pure for them. Oh, I'm just supporting autistic children. So when I come in and I have to tell them, okay, it matters how. It matters what support. It matters because if that quote unquote therapy is somebody who actually sees this kid as a series of behaviors, you know, their behavioral intervention people, their title is behavior technician. These are people who are exposed to 3-year-olds for sometimes 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. Behavioral technicians, they're there to, I don't know, make your robot child act the way it's supposed to. And that's scary stuff. And the fact that support for that often comes from what is the left, what is supposed to be the progressive side of politics. Yeah, it's awful. It feels terrible. But let me tell you, it feels a lot less terrible when you're in a group of other neurodivergent people who are ready to fight back and support each other, not just in political fights, but in personal ones, in making sure you're getting the medical care that you need and the supplies that you need, and making sure that you're being taken care of when disasters have struck. And when you have that group of people that are ready to, in the long haul, because this is a long-term fight. And so being able to actually build community like that means everything. I think not just to me, but to everybody within the NDNDP. It means quite a lot that we're able to do it. So
a lot of the activists I've talked to speak of building communities. I think that's kind of pivotal to organizing personally, right? Is first job is bringing people together and making sure your spaces are safe and, you know, protecting them, and so folks can grow and share and fight. But I imagine in our work as organizers on the left that perhaps sometimes we're making spaces that aren't all that friendly to autistic people. Is there some things that a lot of us are, you know, I was in a meeting the other day, and very progressive folks, but there was just this huge encouragement to turn on your camera. You had to turn on your camera. It was kind of like you weren't really participating. And immediately I thought of how uncomfortable that would make me on certain days. And so I felt forced to turn my camera on. But, you know, things like that. Are there practical things that we could do better as organizers so that our spaces are more accommodating?
Well, that's an excellent example for sure, making sure people don't have to turn cameras on. Partially because my experience is different than some people's in that I'm actually pretty comfortable being on a Zoom and just like not looking at either myself or the other person because I am really bad at things like eye contact and facial, moderating my face. I'm just not good at that. Because it takes so much motor energy that then I can't pay attention to other stuff. The other thing is being able to, like, stim. So a lot of autistic people will flap our hands or things like this, or we'll rock back and forth. People in meetings will all the time see me rocking back and forth. And things like this are seen as, like, disruptive or impatient or things like this. And for that reason, a lot of people would prefer to just not have their camera on because that's something they really have to worry about. So that's a good example. Another example... inviting autistic people somewhere, or sending attempting to reach out to autistic people when you have taken the words of non-autistic autism advocates as fact. So this is something that people on the left do a lot, is they hear a parent group or something that's called an advocacy group say something, and they will repeat it without critically thinking about it and without looking into it and seeing how the people most impacted actually feel. And now this is the true across cases. There are, like, books by white people about white fragility, for example, which is like, okay, yeah, for sure. Why would I listen to a white person about that, though? Because that's not something a white person is actually going to be the best source for. And so that's not something I'm going to do. I'm going to turn to books by black people if I want to hear about anti-black racism. You know, I'm going to turn, I'm going to turn to resources by trans folks when I want to hear what trans experiences are like. And for some reason, on the left, it's okay to hear from non-autistic people about what autistic lives are like. I don't know why that's okay. I know it has been the case with other marginalizations before, absolutely, and with other oppressed people. That's absolutely the case. But I do not understand why people on the left act that way towards disabled folks and towards autistics. And I should say all disabled folks, because it's not just autistics. It's also non-disabled people who fight so hard for things like Bill C-7 to expand access to MAID. That's another thing, to expand access to medical assistance in death. And that's something that, again, the biggest advocates for that, and they call themselves that, the biggest advocates for those expansions are not the people that expansion's going to kill. Yet, those are the people who are seen as experts. Those people who, you know, are disregarding how many lives we're going to lose because of that expansion, and lives that could have been led happily and comfortably if people were given the resources and accommodations that they need. And again, it comes back to this. And now, yes, the further expansions upcoming, the further expansions include folks whose only diagnosis is mental illness. It also includes mature minors, which means parents can decide that their disabled child wants medically assisted death. Obviously, that's horrifying. The expansion to MAID was supported by all the major parties in Parliament. It was supported by the NDP, the Liberals, and the Conservatives. Opposed it some of the time, and some of the time didn't. They opposed it on religious reasons, which is not the right reason to oppose it. It's one of those, like, it's not that we agree on why, but this is bad.
That's gotta hurt, though. I hate, like, when the Conservatives have the right take on a bill and you just don't want to agree with them.
For the wrong reasons.
Because I cringed when you said that. I was hoping it was fully unanimous. We could hate them all equally.
No, sadly. Honestly, though, it really is scary stuff. The Liberal government appointed the Liberal government called a speaker for the deliberations about the expansion just this past week. And this guy that they called up has advocated for parents to be able to kill their kids with medically assisted death as young as 5 years old. I should say, the thing that got me really into advocacy, I thought I was, because of these stigmas, because I had only been in mental crisis for a decade and a half and I didn't consider that serious. I considered myself not disabled enough to really talk about it. And I should just be quiet about it because I'm not severe enough to actually talk about being disabled. And the thing that really actually got me to understand that disabled people's lives are valuable enough and my own life is valuable enough that I need to acknowledge how hard things are and I need to acknowledge how many accommodations I need. Yes, for listeners, my life got considerably easier and I had considerably less challenges once I acknowledged I needed a lot of accommodations and started putting those accommodations in place. But until I went to an event which was co-produced by Autistics United Canada. Autistics United Canada is an absolutely incredible national advocacy and education group who have done some really important work, and I really respect and appreciate Autistics United Canada. And they had put on an event for the Disability Day of Mourning. Now, this is a day every year. It's an annual vigil for disabled children and disabled adults, disabled people who were killed by their caregivers, filicide. There's an advocate who did a speech at this Disability Day of Mourning event that I happened to get into because I, at that time, was trying to figure out what resources there were for autistic people around. And I found this event and I went to it. And Rishav Banerjee, who is another amazing advocate, writer, and researcher, Rishav did a speech where he talked about how the murdered disabled child is vilified and the parent is given praise because they had so much on their plate. And this is the case when parents, decide that their autistic non-speaking child is just so miserable that they would be better off deceased. Then, now they're going to have a legal route to do that. And that means that non-speaking autistic will never have the chance to develop a system of communication. We will never get to learn what was in their brain. They may never go on to do the things that they might have done. They may not go on to do the art, to write the poems, to do the paintings, to have the relationships that they would have had. And it's because people have decided that disabled folks' lives are not valuable and can't be valuable. And unfortunately, we talk about misconceptions and oppression, and that's the root of it. That's ableism right there. And this is something, C7 is something that has really called into sharp attention the lack of disability justice education on the left. It's been being talked about for, more than a year. And still there are people on the left saying, well, I support medically assisted death. And disabled people have to say, yeah, we do as well. But lifting these safeguards right now and expanding access to children and people whose only diagnosis is mental illness and people who do not have a foreseeable death and people who are only suffering because they don't have the housing and the supports and the living support that they need to live the good life they have in their potential future. Instead, these people are going to die. This is something that was brought to the federal NDP convention. There was an emergency resolution last year at the convention, which asked the party urgently specifically to consult with autistic people about support of things like C7 and the National Autism Strategy, which is a piece of legislation which is being written by non-autistic people and non-autistic organizations. Obviously, and as these go through, the problem is that it's not that I don't like this. It's that it's deadly. It's that this expansion, I can talk about how autistic people are stigmatized and ostracized and treated horribly everywhere from school to workplaces. And then I can tell you that we're about to make it so anyone who's depressed can immediately qualify for MAID. We can't build community with disabled folks. We can't help disabled people if we're just offering them only death and nothing else. And unfortunately, that's a message that seems not to have resonated yet with much of the left, which is in Canada, which is a really startling thing. Yeah.
We're getting near the kind of end of our session. I imagine I'm going to have you on again to talk more specifically on some campaigns that are going to shape up. But if you could have the allyship of listeners, if you could call them to action to help with your work, what's one thing, or, what broadly could you tell them where they need to start?
Listen to non-speaking autistic people is where I would start. Presume competence of non-speakers and listen to non-speaking autistic people. There are non-speakers who have been absolutely unbelievably patient as social movements and politicians have talked over them and walked over them, and I cannot tell you how much non-speaking autistics have been through because of so-called progressive people's insistence on listening to non-autistic people about what experiencing life as an autistic person is like. I'm sure I can provide some links that can be in the description of the podcast to some folks that folks can listen to and folks that people can check out. I highly recommend Communication First and the International Association for Spelling as Communication as starting points, because those are organizations that have endless resources from non-speaking people. Because when we talk about, this kid, he's crying and running away, so we have to deal with this behavior, we're missing the experience of that human being. We are missing the experience of that person. And if we can go to somebody else who screams and runs away when things are overwhelming, who has developed a system of communication, who has been given access to communication, and we can ask them, what is that experience like? What do you need in that situation? That is worth 1,000,000 times more than any temporary behavioral performance of not having that experience. And so, my number one thing is get your information from non-speaking autistic people about autism.
And I feel like I have to add the disclaimer to also believe them.
Yes.
Whatever I don't care how absurd you think the accommodation sounds, a kind of light, a texture, just believe them.
Yeah.
Because that is my biggest frustration, is trying to have folks understand and be empathetic towards it in order to provide the accommodation. Well, that doesn't make sense to you.
And again, it's about the experience of it, right? It's about recognizing that other people who have different kinds of brain than you and different kinds of nervous system interact with the world differently than you. And when you can accept that and acknowledge that, actually a lot of stuff becomes less frustrating, and it becomes a lot easier to maintain relationships and communication and all kinds of other things. Once you can acknowledge the way I would experience this situation is not necessarily how that person is experiencing this situation. You have to listen to that person, and exactly right, you have to believe that person about how they are experiencing the situation, because otherwise you're not doing equity, you're not doing justice, you're doing ego. And that's not what our movements are supposed to be made out of.
Yeah. Yeah. No, why do you need the accommodation? Because I think like a lot of people don't realize why. Right? They just know, I don't know why that light bothers me, right?
Yeah.
It just does.
Yeah.
I don't know why I get home at the end of the day and need to decompress for half an hour before anyone asks me a question. I just do.
Yeah, 100%.
And yeah, having to defend that, especially children who most certainly cannot articulate why something needs to be turned off or on or whatever, is incredibly frustrating. So like, although folks can advocate for themselves, I'm so grateful that there are people that, take this onus on themselves the way that you have, the way that, other guests have too.
One of the other things that really sucks is I would rather have given this interview to I would rather have brought a non-speaker up and been like, hey, do you want to do this interview? But right now on the left, it's not really safe for autistic people to be advocating. The reason that I push as hard as I do, and the reason that I'm making the space I'm making, is because non-speakers and autistic folks in general right now don't feel safe engaging in a lot of political stuff. You've got to hide yourself there. You can't, there's so much ableism, there's so much inaccessibility, that a lot of folks are just tuning out. And unfortunately, when we do things like we have this, this actually kind of ties into the idea of like disability fakers. This is, again, another conservative ideal that a lot of leftists unfortunately also hold, which is this idea that there are people taking advantage of accommodations and disability supports, which is absurd because you have to fight literally like through fire and brimstone to get supports and to get accommodations. And I don't know anyone who would do that, like, just to get an accommodation that didn't help them, that they didn't need. That's just not how that works. And unfortunately,
to me, that makes no sense at all, because I would rather hide it than be open and beg for an accommodation.
Yeah, absolutely. Then beg, and then to lose your, your sense of authenticity and all of this, because you've got to, go through these dehumanizing trials just to get accommodations. And yeah, the asking why is like, it's a certain kind of cruelty, right? You've got to try to, especially for folks who have never received adequate support, who don't have the words to advocate for themselves. Even if you are speaking, if you've never been actually exposed to the types of accommodations and the types of sensory experiences and all of this, then how on earth are you supposed to know what to ask for and how? Let alone to explain. Like, I can't explain the physical internal reaction that's happening, when the air conditioner is so loud that I can't think. I don't know how to explain that past that. But that's 100% a thing that will stop me from getting any work done all day long. And that's not something that folks for whom that is not a problem can really understand. It's not something that people have a reference for. But we've got this sort of trend of people that will say things like, oh, everyone's a little neurodivergence, insert here. So people will say, oh, everyone's a little ADHD sometimes, or something like that.
I hear that all the time.
Everybody's
I hear that
somewhere on the spectrum or whatever. And the problem with phrases like that is it leads these people who are not autistic, who are not ADHD, to believe that an event that has happened to them allows them to understand what it's like to live as an autistic person every single day. And that's just not the case. They just don't have that frame of reference. And I really believe that's been a huge driver. That kind of language and that kind of attitude has been a huge driver towards people saying things like, why would you need that accommodation? We all have trouble with bright lights sometimes. Why would you need that accommodation when the rest of us can just deal with it? And it's because we're not experiencing it the same way at all. But yeah, there's this belief that, well, I experience things, so that's how it must be. And yeah, that absolutely screws people out of accommodations all the time, which is awful. I actually also really appreciate the point about like having to go beg for accommodations, because I really do want to highlight, like, it's an incredibly dehumanizing and disrespectful process in every institution to go there and get accommodations and to go there and be openly disabled. There aren't institutions that have made that an empowering process. I can't name one other than, like, folks in grassroots organizing groups, like people like the Disability Justice Network. And I would hope some of the work that I do as well, but I'm not the one that gets to say that even. And I have to recognize that.
So, like, what does that look like? Maybe actively providing accommodations, people are likely to need, asking ahead of events
100%.
What accommodations, organizers can expect, rather than waiting for somebody to come and say, I need subtitles, right? I need subtitles. Can you put them on? I mean, those are just small kind of common sense things, but I've found, like, just adding an accessibility field, to an invitation.
Absolutely.
So that, nobody has to figure out what the mechanism is.
And then following up on it, right? Because another problem is that sometimes people will put something like a field in, but then they'll decide it's not useful because they aren't following up on it. They, the gatekeepers, are like, oh, this system's too hard for me. I need to just not do this, which is unfortunately what happens in a lot of institutions and organizations, is that non-disabled people really don't understand how vital those accommodations are and the space to make those accommodations. Nobody wants to go to an event and have to go to, get in through the back door because there's no ramp at the front, and then it's so loud in there and there's absolutely no break and there's no, access to things. Nobody wants to go through that. But we force people to by not proactively thinking about it. And I also don't want anyone to believe that you can foresee every possible accommodation that's necessary. It is very wise to get in the habit of, a semi-universal design. A lot of folks don't have the, especially grassroots groups, don't have resources to redesign every single one of their bits of work all at once. But attempting to make sure that all of your spaces provide a base accommodation group or a base list of accommodations. And then having that space where you know that people will be listened to and people know that they will be listened to. Having that space to say, hey, what doesn't work for you? If there's something you need, please let us know. Here's the resources to let us know. We're not just going to say, oh, email us. We're going to actually...
Email the accessibility officer at an email address I'm going to mention once and not put in the chat.
Exactly the kind of thing.
That doesn't happen, does it?
Wouldn't it be horrible if it did? Wouldn't that be so exclusionary and anti-equitable and oppressive if that was how people were going about things? And so, yeah, it's really, it is unacceptable stuff, and it goes on every day.
So, Lulu, I've asked you a lot of questions, but is there anything that I didn't ask that you definitely wanted to share?
Yeah. One thing I will say is being an autistic advocate in supposedly progressive spaces has been really illuminating for me. And I say that because autistic people are presumed to be incapable no matter what we are doing. So I'm currently in a master's degree doing actual research on autistic youth's well-being. I've also been studying autism and autistic people for something like a decade.